You're looking at this conflict in a broader Eurasian context that in the past was just the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It's no longer that. This is something much broader.
Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
So welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Riskology by Infortal, where we look at the impact of geopolitical risks onto businesses operating in today's global climate. And with recent events, my colleague here, Dr. Ian Oxnevad, and I really thought it would be important to pause and talk through some of the myriad of issues related to what's going on currently in Israel and in the Middle East. Sure that you're aware the situation is changing very rapidly. And so we do plan to revisit what's going on in the region throughout the podcast series as we move forward in the coming weeks. Horrifying, the imagery and the stories that are coming out of the region, very politically charged. Of course, we are not really going to focus too heavily onto the politics of the situation, but really looking at what this might mean for the region longer term, and really how you need to think about this in terms of doing business in the region, but also as a case study and really what you need to be prepared for in today's climate. And so what we thought we would do is start with a few questions here from my colleague who's head of geopolitical risk here at Infortal Worldwide on the current ongoing conflict. And Ian, to kick it off, I thought it would be sort of important to add a little context surrounding what's going on in the region in terms of international relations. You know, we had stronger relationships really coming through between Saudi Arabia and Israel as an example. We've seen some negotiations going on in the region that historically have not happened. How does this situation that we've got now impact the progress that was being made?
Yeah, Chris, I think the first thing everybody needs to understand is that like the Middle East from 10 years ago no longer exists. It used to be almost a cliche that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the premier conflict in the region. You had ISIS that was just starting to come into its forefront in terms of its apex of power in Iraq and Syria. You had the Arab Spring. You had Afghanistan still ongoing. You had Iran's nuclear program. And a lot of that seems stable. But if you look at the tumult since 2000, you had 9/11, you had the invasion of Iraq and the toppling of Saddam. Ever since the millennium, you've had a Middle East that nobody really predicted. You had a loss of balance of power between the Sunni and Shia worlds, between Iraq and Iran. After 2003, you had Turkey that went from being a relatively democratic country to being an authoritarian one and neo-Ottoman and interventionist. You had calcifying secular religious divides, not only in Arab countries like Lebanon, but also in Israel itself, in Turkey, and other countries in the region. And I think this needs to be put into context now in the sense that the Middle East is not being driven by just simple Western sort of counterterrorism narratives anymore. There's a different logic now with this, because we were speaking before the episode started, and this feels different. What happened with Hamas and it is happening with Hezbollah and Israel, it feels qualitatively different than previous attacks, because Israel has had skirmishes with these groups for decades now, but there's something that doesn't feel the same about this. And I think the reason that this feels different, according to most analysts, is that you're looking at the Middle East in a new Eurasia now. This is not the Middle East of the Cold War. This isn't even the Middle East of the post 9/11 era. This is the Middle East in basically the battle for Eurasia. And by that, I mean you have China looking west now. You have the Belt and Road Initiative. You have India trying to expand its influence against China as well, because they're competing. You have Russia that's reasserting itself. You have a new interventionism in Turkey, in the Mediterranean world. And what that's doing is you're sort of looking at a 21st century version of a much older dynamic in the sense of who's going to control Eurasia and Eurasian trade. And if you put it in that context, what you see is you've had a number of massive events happen that nobody foresaw coming, or most analysts didn't see coming, with things like the Abraham Accords, where you see these higher tech countries in the Persian Gulf that are Arab, Sunni Arab. They see Israel as part of not only the Middle East fabric, but also the key to its future prosperity. You look at Iran in contrast, you see a calcification of what is essentially a dying regime. It's just a matter of whether or not it goes nuclear. You've had ongoing massive protests in Iran over the killing of women who are protesting against forced modesty laws. You have a disillusioned youth in Iran, especially in urban areas, that aren't necessarily pro-Western, but they're very skeptical of the mullahs in charge and the theocratic regime that's currently in power. And if you sort of juxtapose that quote unquote old Middle East against the new Middle East, in which Israel is a part of it and is accepted by specifically Sunni powers, you're looking at a threat to actors like Hamas and ironically also China's Belt and Road Initiative, because you have to keep in mind that just a few weeks ago, you had the India, Gulf, Israel, Middle East corridor thing get announced. And that's a direct threat to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, China, Iran, and Russia have been collaborating for decades now, since the Iranian Revolution, in the sense of collaborating in Eurasia and balance of power in the region, specifically against the United States. But now it's not just the United States. You have regional powers that can stand on their own to a degree. And that IMEC and India is being integrated into that. Also, the U.S. presence sort of shifting towards countering China, not only in the Pacific, but in the Indian Ocean and elsewhere in the world. This is part of that. And this is kind of a manifestation of all these things coming to a head, in the sense you have a proxy in Hamas from Iran trying to sort of stop this burgeoning, warming ties between the Sunni Gulf and Israel. And that not only benefits Iran, but it also benefits China indirectly, and even say Russia, because if you have munitions going from the U.S. to Israel, even though Israel can probably handle this war without significant military assistance like Ukraine, it's still all coming from the same source. So in that sense, it does stress existing security ties for the U.S. So that's what you're looking at. You're looking at this conflict in a broader Eurasian context that in the past was just the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It's no longer that. This is something much broader.
I was just going to say, based on what you've just described, it seems as though there's other actors, there's other nation states sort of moving behind the scenes to counter basically how the recent negotiations have been going. If things do start to escalate, if the tensions grow, and we're already seeing some movement on the military side, even the U.S. has sort of repositioned an aircraft carrier just off the shore. How do you think that will potentially escalate across the region? Do you think this will remain contained and geographically where it is now, or could you see this expanding?
I could see this expanding. First of all, let's just look at Gaza and the security situation in the Middle East itself, like in the Levant, Israel, Lebanon, the Palestinian territories. If you look at that, it really depends on how Israel decides to fight this. So there's already talks about urban fighting, et cetera, Stalingrad type scenarios. I think that's definitely true, but at the same time, I think it's premature to use those models to talk about this, because Gaza is such a contained area. You're talking about a very small corridor that's only a few square miles. Half of it is ocean. Israel doesn't need to invade the way that everyone thinks to actually cut Hamas off. If they cut off water, Hamas is going to be stressed very quickly, and it's not going to go well for Hamas. And that changes things diplomatically, of course, and sort of the narrative battles that you see pro and anti what's going on in terms of Israel or which side of the conflict everyone's on. But if Israel handles it that way, I think the odds of it escalating are smaller. If it goes and it starts to get significantly combative in Gaza, then you're going to see a ratcheting up. And in terms of it exploding, if they decide to hit nuclear sites in Iran and try a decapitation strike where they try to take out the Iranian government, that could escalate very quickly. And then it's just a matter of how much control Iran actually has. We know that the protests themselves, which kind of turned into riots at certain times, has stressed Iran's internal security. But if that does happen, the question is what government forms after that, or does Iran implode and become kind of like a Syria 2.0? I don't think anybody knows. But I do think that you're looking at, for certain, instability, at least. It's just a matter of what the magnitude of that is, and also whether or not China decides to take advantage of this and go for Taiwan while everyone is distracted with Ukraine and the Middle East. Because worst case scenario, and I hope to God this doesn't happen, is if you look at Eurasia, because again, we're talking about Eurasia here. If you look at the nuclear powers in Eurasia, Israel, Russia, Pakistan, India, Iran in state of becoming, and China, most of the Eurasian landmass is actually nuclear. And in the worst case scenario, you could potentially have a nuclear catastrophe going all the way from the Ukrainian border and the Tel Aviv beach all the way to the South China Sea if this goes wrong.
The militaristic options within the region.
Yep.
Something that was striking to me, and I think it's coming out through some of the headlines, is sort of the low-tech nature of the attacks and the organization surrounding it. There's been all of this focus on advanced technology and different methods of collecting intelligence, but really these attacks were very low-tech, and it almost looks as though that's where Hamas is trying to keep the conflict in terms of fighting it out. Do you think that will shift at all as we move forward, or do you think this is going to require sort of, as you sort of alluded to earlier, some historic tactics in terms of solving the conflict?
You're already seeing sort of low-tech tactics. Yes, it's low-tech. You had hang gliders. You had rockets. The rockets have gotten better. How they got through the barrier in Gaza, I don't think anybody knows yet. There was an intelligence failure, certainly. Whether or not that was a breach in Israel's technical capacity and its technical defenses, or if they were just distracted because of negotiations with Saudi Arabia, and you had judicial protests ongoing that kind of divided the country in their own constitutional crisis there in Israel, that probably sucked a lot of attention away. So from that standpoint, Israel may have been distracted, but I don't think we know yet in terms of how that happened.
Yeah, I think the intel story coming out of this is going to be really interesting. There's going to be a lot of lessons learned, but I think it's too early to tell, as you mentioned, exactly sort of where the key failures were. But this is absolutely a failure on the intel side, which I think caught everyone off guard because so much attention and so much effort has been spent in building up that apparatus over the years, which has, arguably been pretty successful. So this is a major lapse somewhere. So it'll be interesting to see as those stories come out. On the flip side, so jumping from low tech to high tech, and this is definitely an area that I know you've got deep experience in looking at, and that's terrorism or terrorist financing. There is a few headlines that are pointing to cryptocurrency as being a major factor and tool used in this scenario. I don't know if you've seen some of the headlines. I think it was the Wall Street Journal who was hitting on it at first, but do you have any thoughts there in terms of how the cryptocurrency dynamic has allowed for terrorism financing to flourish in the recent past?
Yeah. So I'll say this, showing my cards here, that I'm a crypto advocate to a degree.
Sure.
But I think, yes, the crypto conversation is part of it. It's also money that Iran has gotten through oil sales and also through unfrozen sanctions and largesse from the West. In that sense, humanitarian aid that Hamas gets, because Hamas, its organizational structure, they say they have a humanitarian side and a combative side. But what all this fails to take into account is that money is fungible. And you're not really talking about money laundering. You're talking about money dirtying, in the sense that you can have money from a totally legal source, whether that be from humanitarian aid, paychecks, normal business activity, and then it's devoted for an illegal purpose, aka terrorism. And cryptocurrency is one form of moving that value, because you're not talking about dollars, you're talking about value and how you can move that value to get what you want. And Hamas is very good at this. Terrorists are very good at this, moving value from place to place. In the past, they used toys, of all things, to get the money to build weapons. What they did was they had trade-based money laundering. They imported toys from China into Gaza. Then they auctioned off the toys and they got the cash. It's about laundering the value. And unfortunately, that can consist in anything. That can be food. It could be toys. It could be cryptocurrency. Crypto's nice because crypto can hold value, especially if you're talking about Bitcoin, and it can be relatively untraceable. And at the same time, it's very liquid. You can send it like cash, unlike trade-based money laundering. So in that sense, you can move a lot of value very quickly, unlike with certain other forms of laundering. So I'm not surprised at all if they used crypto.
Yeah, it wouldn't be surprising at all. And similar to how the backstory will come out on the intel side, I think the funding side will be really interesting to see if there's any new methods or techniques that have been established to move that cash around. Circling back to our area of expertise and some of the things that we look at here at Infortal, it's important to look at this from the lens of making sure that your compliance programs, particularly if you're in the payments place or facilitating the transfers of funds, are up to date so that you don't have any risk exposure to situations like this. Because imagine the reputational damage that would come from being linked to funding what we've just seen unfold. It would be catastrophic for any business. And so really important to make sure that, one, you're staying current of what the current trends are in illicit transfers, but also making sure that your compliance program is robust enough to meet those emerging challenges. And so I think there's definitely going to be some lessons learned coming out of this situation.
And some lawsuits, because under counterterrorism financing laws, financial institutions are liable.
Yeah, the liabilities, it's endless in terms of potential liabilities once you bring terrorism into the mix. We'll shift gears and look at the situation from the standpoint of a business operating in the region. What are some things that are top of mind from your vantage point in terms of how they can look at moving forward and building a plan despite having so close in geographic space to the conflict that's emerged?
I think there's different levels to the business risk with this that's even different from normal conflict risks, because you're going to have expanded counterterrorism financing regulations and laws coming out of this for sure. You're going to have civil suits for sure. On a more populist end, you're going to have consumer boycotts, boycotts, and sanctions, where you're going to have more sanctions levied on certain actors like Hamas, Hezbollah. You're going to potentially see their humanitarian sides sanctioned. You're going to see sanctions on Iran probably increase, potentially even from other places that have not traditionally sanctioned Iran, such as in Europe or East Asia. You could see boycott, sort of Israel's been a target of a boycott and divestment movement. You're going to see heightened insurance costs for sure, potentially security costs. Energy is going to become a big deal, especially if the conflict widens, because if conflict emerges with Iran, it's going to affect the Gulf states as well, which produce oil, and that's going to potentially disrupt all production in the Middle East. And what you're going to see there is you're going to see oil potentially skyrocket, especially if Russian oil and energy is already cut off, and that's going to have a massive inflationary pressure. And then there's more bad news. The more bad news is that war itself creates inflationary pressures because it demands monetary expansion. So as war fighting continues, you have monetary costs in the sense of humanitarian assistance, rebuilding. If major conflict starts to emerge, you're going to see these pressures expand exponentially. And that's going to put a damper on all business, not only in the region, but also globally, especially if energy gets involved and Iran gets directly involved in the conflict. So you're looking at inflation for sure, sanctions. You're looking at potentially supply chain disruptions if the Suez Canal or the Straits of Hormuz get hit, or any major infrastructure there. You're looking at potential disruption. So you're looking at a whole basket of risk, everything from reputation to sanctions to civil liabilities to more.
I think you hit on a lot of the key issues that I think will come to light in the coming weeks and months. And it'll be extremely important for companies in the region to sort of keep a close eye on the developing regulatory landscape. And then, as you mentioned, pricing is going to be significantly impacted, especially for key commodities. And on the flip side, there is a huge incentive from a financial standpoint to stabilize the region. So let's hope that we can get through whatever conflict is looming to get back to focusing on the positive development that was starting to show signs of light, especially in Israel. And again, as we mentioned earlier, with the emerging negotiations with other countries in the region. But I think for the foreseeable future, it's going to be heavily focused on looking at those key elements that you mentioned before.
Business operating in this environment by having to basically ramp up security costs and intelligence spending on their own in order to figure out ways to still connect to capital, connect to customers, conduct advertising, obtain the right insurance, and know who they do business with, because that's going to be very fluid. You're going to look at massive fraud, massive costs, sanctions busting, all sorts of things like that, where every transaction becomes a potential massive risk.
Yeah. As we've recently discussed with clients in some of the presentations that we've given recently, the trend of nearshoring or reshoring from certain regions, particularly those that are operating or have a manufacturing base in China, I think it's going to be even more important to really look at those plans and what the options are going forward. Because again, now we've got another region that is all of a sudden hot in terms of conflict, and making sure that you have a plan mapped out, depending on what region you're in, is going to be even more important, I think, as we head into 2024 than it was just a week ago. And so we just have to see sort of how this plays out. Anyone who's operating internationally needs to really look at sort of what their plan B and C are, depending on how the conflicts shape up.
Yep.